The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the sixth day, second to the last day of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico in January 2023. Mark Epstein is a psychiatrist. When he was growing up, he found himself filled with a discomforting feeling of emptiness. It plagued him. And when he was in high school, he wondered if maybe it might be more common than he thought. And so he polled his high school class, which apparently was rather small. I think he said it was something like 47 people. And the only person who did not say that they were also experiencing feelings of emptiness, and this is not the emptiness of Zen understanding. This is the emptiness of something's not quite right. I'm empty. I should be feeling more real. And the only person that did not admit to that, who felt like he wasn't feeling any feelings of emptiness, hadn't felt any feelings of emptiness, was the head football player in their high school, who Epstein remarked was not one of intellectual proficiency. And that maybe have something to do with it, because perhaps, particularly if he was a football player, he was more tuned in to the physical experience of being. After all, he had to pay a certain amount of attention to guide his team to win games. Everybody else was focused, apparently, on getting into college, and Epstein himself got into Harvard. So there must have been some instigation to exceed intellectually in that high school. And it still plagued him. And he began to take psychology courses. He actually, I think it was in his second year, made an appointment with the university psych clinic to ask to be seen by a therapist, who reminds me very much of the first time I ever did that. And that was when I was also in college. He was in his second year, I was in my third year. And therapy back then was very different from how it is now. In my own experience, I walked in after I had apparently been approved to have therapy through a questionnaire of open-ended questions, which actually was much more enlightening than the therapy itself. And the therapy consisted of an hour of sitting across from a therapist who was sitting behind a desk, who didn't say a word unless I did say something. And we had a number of silent hours where it didn't appear that anything was being shifted at all. And I was still having nightmares and still quite troubled back then. And then one day I had a whole hour in my amazingly intense schedule. By that time, I was a mother. My son had been born between semesters, my junior year in college. My husband worked 2 jobs and went to school full time. I worked periodically and went to school full time. And we scheduled our classes so that we could trade the baby buggy back and forth. It was very intense. And to have a whole hour was simply miraculous. And it was springtime, and I sat on a wall at the university and just basked in that luxury of having a whole hour in the sun At the end of the hour, I realized why I had the hour. It was because I had conveniently forgotten my appointment with the therapist. And that said to me, perhaps it was more helpful to me to sit in the sun for an hour than to sit across the room from my therapist in a silent meeting. And so I stopped going to therapy. In those early days of Epstein's training he became a psychiatrist, and his training was similar. His first experience, as I started to say, of therapy himself was he described the man as being quite elegant, extremely elegantly dressed, with very big feet and very polished shoes. And it was supposedly this therapist was trained in short-term psychodynamic therapy, but it doesn't sound like he was acting that way, because I've been through that as well. And at any rate, at the second session, Epstein went to speak with him about this pervasive feeling of emptiness that he had. And the second session, the psychiatrist said to him, "You don't need to come back anymore. Your problem is an Oedipus complex. And that should take care of it." Well, it didn't. And eventually, Epstein became a psychiatrist with his 4 years of specialty training in a hospital. He was trying to help people who had the same sense of emptiness that he had, and he began to be concerned about an increasing sort of transition between therapists who began to focus on putting people in slots, often borderline personality disorder is one in which people are desperately trying to survive. It has a high incidence that precedes it of abuse and trauma, and people who are in that diagnosis often have great difficulty feeling their feelings and go to great extents to try to feel the feelings, and yet those feelings are terrifying to them often. And so they act out in a particular way that is a hallmark of that diagnosis. He didn't feel like his patients really fit that, and so it troubled him. Somewhere along the line, actually it was before he actually became a psychiatrist, he discovered Buddhism very early on in college and has practiced Zen ever since. He's also tried to figure out how he could integrate the teachings of Zen into his work with his psychiatric patients, and knowing that you can't just say, "Hey, sit down and focus your mind and keep going and keep trying to feel, and things will begin to get better, and I'll be here to guide you." He didn't make himself out to be a teacher, and he didn't feel that necessarily the aims at psychiatric treatment were the same as what one could realize through Buddhist practice, and that really is the case. In my experience, there is a kind of a big fat gray area where they overlap, but in my experience, Buddhist practice goes much deeper. Nonetheless, Buddhist practitioners often can benefit, as I did, from therapy. And of course, my initial therapy experience was not one that I would necessarily say that about, although I did get a couple of insights, one being understanding that maybe some space in my life would make a big difference. But I also have had many years of therapy since then, and it has been very helpful. Psychotherapy has evolved over the years since the 1950s and 60s, and particularly in the last 15 or 20 years, when it began to recognize that trauma was a big player in the background of the lives of many, many, many people who were having psychological difficulties. And a lot of research has been done into how that can be helped. And that is terrific. To that end, we have the Regaining Balance retreats for women veterans with PTSD here at Mountain Gate in the summer times. They're shorter, they're not Zen sesshin. We do teach them the extended out breath because it's a very grounding, presence allowing practice. And we also teach them some of the other practices that can help them make their way through difficult feelings, through tuning into sensations in their bodies and translating them, for example, into art or poetry, or simply to feel them. And we also teach them the loving kindness meditation as well. And they also do half an hour twice a day of Zazen, just with the breath practice. There's no mention of anything else. There's no religious connotations to it. When we talk about the Kuan Yin on the altar, it's expressed as what it is, which is a representation of the innate compassion in every being. That compassion is often quite hidden from us, and so we don't necessarily act out on it, but it is there for inspiration and to help us remember that we are deeply endowed in that. So my whole life, I also, like Epstein, had a feeling of emptiness, of incompleteness, of something missing. And I also had a sense that there was indeed something missing, and that something missing was something that if I reached far enough, deeply enough, if I knew how to reach far enough, deeply enough, I could reconnect with. And I think that is prevalent in pretty much everybody who comes to Zen practice. As I grew up, I had various experiences. I was drawn to architecture and design, and received training in that in university and also after that, and worked in those fields: graphic design, architectural design, and I also taught kindergarten in Thailand because I was still married to my husband back then, and he was a diplomat assigned to Chiang Mai, Thailand. And when the first year we were there, the Presbyterian Missionary School needed a kindergarten teacher. They had been through 7 already before the end of the school year, and there still were several months left in the school year. And the last kindergarten teacher lasted 2 weeks, carrying around a thermos of martinis. The kids were crazy, understandably, but we had a nice big room and it had a piano. And so since I had gotten myself, I actually had been in art education initially in college, so I had had some education courses. And because we were trained in the Thai language, my husband and I both, it was expected that we would go to remote areas in Thailand, and with my kids, I would end up being their teacher. So I also went prepared to teach the kids as well. And they were, Greg was 4 at the time, Randy was 6 at the time. And so it was perfect for me to start teaching kindergarten. And it worked out well. The kids were great even though they were wild. When they got way out of hand, I would just go to the piano and start hitting chords and get them to jump or squat or whatever to sort of blow off some of that energy, march around, and it worked. And so I was asked to teach again the second year. I didn't have the piano that year, but I had a mixed bunch of kids, one of whom did not speak English. He was a little bit older than the rest, and he was German. He did speak Thai, so we could communicate to a certain degree with that language. And it was interesting. I remember one time, one little boy who was the son of missionaries. At the time, there were various different missionaries in Thailand, and there were two groups of Christian, I assume they were fundamentalists, but I don't know for sure. I don't even know what the names of their churches were, but they had opposing views. They were the same, I don't know what you call it, sect, if you want to call it that, of Christianity, but one of them believed in music and the other believed that it was, anathema is a kind way to say that they did not believe in having music, particularly not in church. Anyway, this was a little boy who I think belonged to the first group, and all of a sudden he's jumping around, and all of a sudden a big long centipede comes running out of his back of his shirt, which had been loose, thankfully. We did have some things in Thailand that we did have in Burma, but not quite so significantly. So that was fulfilling up to a point. And of course, then we were transferred. And then I got a job in a department store, actually, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, because my husband was sent there to get further training in Southeast Asia studies because he was considered a Southeast Asian expert by the State Department, hence being trained in the Thai language and in Burmese. And then we were at the State Department for a while, and I got a job doing commercial interior design. And that was fulfilling up to a point. And then we were assigned to Turkey, where I went. There was Middle East Technical University, Ortadoğu Teknik Üniversitesi, and it was theoretically, because it was an international university, taught in English. And so I entered the architecture program in the third year there, and which was very interesting. I just discovered my metric architectural scale today. I was going to give it to Leroy, but he looked at it and said, "This is metric." We don't use metric measurements in the United States beyond a certain extremely limited amount. So I'm not quite sure what I'll do with that scale. It's a really nice one. And then my life fell apart. I had done a lot of different things in my life, had a lot of different careers in a fairly short time in various different, very interesting fields to me, but at a certain point, that interest kind of fell off a cliff, and the emptiness, the feeling of something lacking, came back. And thanks to the extremity of what happened to me, I knew that there was not going to be anything outside me, not the most ideal job, not the most ideal anything. And there I was, a diplomatic wife, going to fancy parties, wearing silk dresses and high heels and dangly earrings, and trying to nurse a drink because I hated drinking liquor, still do. I don't do it It is like when the Native Americans supposedly called it firewater. That's exactly what it tastes like to me, which actually turned out to anger a lot of people. But the diplomatic corps was interesting. It was interesting living in all those different countries. But always that sense of emptiness kept coming back. And again, it was not the emptiness that Buddhism speaks of. So recognizing that there really was not anything outside myself that I could depend on for lasting happiness, I bit the bullet and started doing Zazen. And it was dreadful. It was not all sweetness and light as many people dream it will be. It was dreadful because I had a history of, let's just say, extremely challenging experiences. And when we do Zazen, these kinds of things begin to come up. And we need the tools to be able to work with them in a healthy way. Epstein's book, this one that I was speaking of most recently, is titled, is it Coming Apart Without Falling, coming to pieces without falling apart. And it's an interesting title because through our Zen practice, we begin to see where we're caught in conditioning, in ideas about ourselves, in a self-image in particular, which comes as a result of conditioning and ideas about ourselves. And most of us cling tightly to that self-image for dear life. It's frightening to think that we might be who we really underground think we might really be. So we put a mask on. We engage in a charade. And all the time it feels empty because it is. It's a play. So then the big question comes, who are we? Really? Without the mask, without the charade, without the conditioning, without the assumptions. Well, the Buddha said that we are perfect just as we are. No need for improvement. No need for excising negativity. We are perfect and we are endowed with great compassion and wisdom, transcendental wisdom. But we fail to perceive it because our minds are so tied up in knots through this delusive thinking that comes as a result of our conditioning and our assumptions about ourselves. If we could only look in a magic mirror and see ourselves as we really are, it would make an enormous difference in the entire world. But the only mirror we have really is Zen practice. Psychotherapy can take us a long way. It can help a lot. But if there is still that yearning to be free, Zen practice is where we need to go. And both together can be extremely helpful, as I experienced in my own life. The fundamental practice in Zen is developing awareness and attention. To that end, we have the extended out breath, which is very grounding and which allows us, if it's done properly, to focus, to narrow our focus and also expand our awareness at the same time, which sounds like it can't happen, but it is that way. And we have many ways in which to do that. It's an uphill struggle for most people because we don't grow up paying attention. And if anything, we grow up trying not to pay attention, because when we tune in to ourselves, we don't like what we feel, we don't like what we think, we don't like how we assume we are perceived by other people. It's wretched. Who wants to go there? And so we develop a way of sort of flying above life. On occasion, like a stone skipping over the water, touching life. At certain times, maybe falling in love, or some other transcendental experience. We've been on a very, very long hike. We're pooped. We're out in the wilderness. It's been a great exercise. And finally, we're in this beautiful vista, and we're pitching our tent, and we feel fulfilled. Or we can be at the side of a lake or the ocean, tuning into the lap of the waves. There are many times when this can happen. Sometimes we'll catch a glimpse of something or somebody that is positive. But in general, these are not constant experiences. And yet we can have a constant experience of fullness, of fulfillment, of joy, of happiness that does not depend on external conditions. In order to get there, we have to really work on paying attention, on tuning into our body and feeling the difficult feelings as sensations without any rhetoric, without any dialogue, just feeling the sensations. That will go a very long way. And then in our everyday life, to work at paying attention. There's so many opportunities. When we built the addition to Mountain Gate, where we were finally going to have a kitchen in the main building, a real kitchen, and there was a conscious decision not to include what is basically ubiquitous in everybody's kitchen these days, which is goes by the brand name of InSinkErator or garbage disposal, and so on. And there's several reasons for this. One is that water is very precious, particularly up here in northern New Mexico, where we depend on the snow on the mountains to bring us our drinking water underground, yes, and also the water with which to raise plants, to feed animals, and so on. It's a pretty parched land. It's called high desert. That said, water is a problem, increasing problem all over the world. One of my sisters is convinced that the next wars will be about water. And there's already been, ever since I've been living in New Mexico, which started in 1981, there has been lawsuits about how much anybody gets, whether it's Colorado or New Mexico or Arizona or California, how much water out of the Colorado River do people get? And in New Mexico, again, it's also how much water out of the Rio Grande do people get? And by the time it gets down to Mexico, it's a dribble. Literally, it's a dribble. And sometimes it dries up completely. So in order to use a garbage disposal, we have to use a lot of water, because you have to run the thing with cold water so that the motor doesn't overheat. But pretty much everybody is so used to scraping plates into the sink, because there will be this wonderful machine that will grind it all up and send it down to the sewer or wherever it's supposed to go. And it's a wonderful opportunity to change that habit pattern by paying attention. We've already had problems because people have dumped things into the sink. Scraps, breadcrumbs, you name it. anything, because we're so habituated to doing that. And in fact, we have a special toilet plunger that is only for sinks, because it has to be used periodically on the piping in those sinks in the kitchen, because they get clogged, even with the little drain sieves. And in fact, we've used it so much, we've had to use it so much, that we actually burst the connections from the pipes and had to call the plumber. So it has some financial incentive as well. But beyond that, it's a really excellent way for each one of us, and we've all been guilty of it, to pay attention to when we are, for example, emptying food bowls from a meal into a smaller container, to really get every scrap of food out of that dish so that nothing has to be rinsed out. That makes a difference. And to also train ourselves so that we don't automatically go to the sink to dump things, little bits of stuff. It's really, really important for our Zen training, and just really important here as well. It costs us a lot of money when it doesn't happen, and it wastes water, which is extremely precious. There's an expression in New Mexico, water is life, and it is. And there's a law in the West, I don't know if it's written or unwritten, that says that anyone who asks for water must be given water. And that means like a drink of water. That doesn't mean that if you ask that you can have the major portion of the acequia run, it doesn't mean that. It means that if somebody comes to you parched and asks for a drink of water, you cannot refuse them. It's that precious. So this is just one way we can work on paying attention. And the more we can pay attention, the deeper we will go in our practice. And yes, we will run into headway. It will not necessarily be easy, because we will be opening to feelings that we have understandably shut down because they were not comfortable or they were even frightening. I had my share of that growing up, and Zen practice has made an enormous difference, along with the therapy. So many, many centuries ago, it is said that a monk asked the master, what is the most important thing for Zen practice? And he was doing calligraphy at the time, so he took up his brush and he wrote the character for attention. And the monk said, attention? Seems like such a simple thing. Why attention? And the master wrote, again, attention. And the monk says, well, what does that mean? And again, the master wrote attention and said, attention means attention. And it seems like such a niggly thing, but it's not. When we really pay attention, it is very different. Our experience is very different. There was the Kobe earthquake in Japan. I was there, not in Kobe, but 90 miles away, at Sogenji. And it was so strong and so intense and for such a long time that it actually moved whole buildings into streets, and completely broke up streets, dropping some of them in half by 3 feet. And in fact, when Mitra-roshi immediately got in touch with other temples in the area, and they made plans as to help with the relief. It took him 5 hours to get to Kobe, which ordinarily would have only been a couple of hours' drive, because there were so many streets that were tumbled up together. It dropped the freeway. It turned the Shinkansen tracks into spaghetti. It was quite an intense experience, even 90 miles away. And Mitra-roshi said, at the end of that day, it started at 6 o'clock in the morning, something like that. We were all in Sanzen, actually, or waiting for Sanzen. And went for quite a while. But at the end of that day, at sunset, there was an elderly woman who stood in the midst of the wreckage with this look of ecstasy on her face, just glorying in the sunset and being alive. It is that level of joy that we can experience through our practice. When we are caught in difficult growings up, which many of us are, it means we have to really work our way through that. But once we do, with the practice, we can be like that elderly woman, gazing in rapture at the sunset, so grateful to be alive after the horror of that day. Japanese homes, traditional Japanese homes, have very heavy tile roofs. They're ceramic. And what happened, because in Kobe, as in a lot of places in Japan, they had sort of pushed the sea further out and filled in that area, and the infill was not stable. Although Kobe itself was on rocks, and there were people in Kobe who didn't even feel the earthquake at all because their homes or businesses were built on rock. But the people who were in the newer parts of Kobe and in those traditional homes or buildings, the buildings collapsed, the homes collapsed. Many people were caught inside if they weren't outright killed. It was winter, and because gas lines ruptured, then fire raced through these old wooden buildings as well. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And yet, in the midst of the horror, she could feel joy. Just like Jacques Lutheran in Buchenwald, once he let go his ideas and allowed himself to be simply present with his dying, truly present with his dying, and then truly present from then on, he found joy. There in the midst of hell, attention and awareness are vital. And so is courage, because what some of us are called upon to face requires courage. But if we are willing to walk into whatever we have to walk into, we will become free. I promise you. I thank you for listening, and now we will stop and recite the 4 vows.